As you guys can see, I'm in the gorgeous south of France on a beachfront in Cannes, and I've just wrapped up a one-to-one call with a peak business systems mentee of mine. During that call specifically, we discussed how to establish caloric intake and rather more specifically a meal plan for a one-to-one client he's working with. So in terms of process from A to B, I'm going to run you guys through how I determine the caloric intake that I should establish for a client I'm working with, and then therefore how I actually proceed with the meal plan. So firstly, if you were to want to be as accurate as possibly can be with an individual that you're working with caloric intake to facilitate a deficit, a maintenance, or even perhaps a caloric surplus, depending on the desired outcome of the client, in order to determine their basal metabolic rate, you guys need to proceed with a DEXA scan. So as part of the onboarding process that I conduct for the client I work with, I proceed with one. From a DEXA scan, we acquire a few key pieces of information. We acquire skeletal muscle tissue, bone density, visceral fat, basal metabolic rate, etc. Now, of course, the most key component of this, or most key piece of information from this particular assessment for every client I work with in the context of their caloric intake and their meal plan is their basal metabolic rate. Once I've acquired this, I then know how many calories that individual needs to consume simply to survive and function on a daily basis without taking into account their energy expenditure. So for myself, for example, my basal metabolic rate, I can't remember specifically what it was, but I believe it came back at about 1.7k calories, and then of course I need to factor in my daily energy expenditure on top of that. And again, that's speculative, I can't remember specifically, but let's say that is a number there. Once I've acquired that information and I've factored in their energy expenditure on a daily basis, so I'm taking into account their step counts and their training frequency, and I factored in, for example, how much lean muscle tissue they're carrying as well, I then know the exact amount of calories that person should be consuming to maintain weight, so their caloric maintenance. Once that's then determined, of course, we then simply determine if the individual's goal is to be in a caloric deficit or a surplus, and we therefore remove calories or simply increase calories. So that establishes our caloric intake for the clients we're working with in the most accurate way possible, rather than being speculative and using generic calculators for caloric and macronutrient intake needs. Okay? Now, once that's been established, typically in the onboarding process of every client I work with, I ask them to actually input 2 to 3 days worth of their food, essentially a food diary, into a platform called Chronometer. Now, Chronometer is essentially a more advanced version of MyFitnessPal and highlights also micronutrient intake and other variables like fiber intake as well from all the meals the client is consuming, which is really, really helpful. Once I've assessed this, I get a pretty key indicator of the client I'm working with's dietary habits, whether or not, for example, they're cognizant of their protein intake, carbohydrates or fats. If they're not cognizant of it, and therefore I need to rectify with them, if their fiber intake is sufficient, if fat intake is high, whatever it may be. Okay, so it gives me good context for kind of where we're at right now, particularly psychologically. With that being said, once that information has then been reviewed, we then move into establishing their meal plan. So for every client I work with, their meal frequency is something we discuss with them based on their preference. They may want to consume 2 meals per day, 3 meals, 4 meals. It depends on their preference, their needs as an individual, and also their work demands and scheduling as well. So we factor that in first. Once that's factored in, I then ask the client to input their meal preferences, so what they'd like to consume for breakfast, lunch, dinner, a snack, etc. Now, the reason why I ask the client for this information is because the last thing I want to do is impose upon a client of mine a meal plan which they wouldn't be happy with. It would simply result in a lack of adherence. So once I have this information from them, I can then reverse engineer how many calories need to be consumed per meal to achieve their deficit, their maintenance, or their surplus, and therefore their macronutrient ranges for those meals. I manipulate the macronutrient ranges based on their meals consumed around training as well. So obviously, meals pre and post training would be greater in carbohydrate density. Meals that, for example, are consumed first thing upon waking or before bed, perhaps wouldn't be necessarily as carbohydrate dense. It depends on what time of day they're training and how significant their training demands are as well in terms of demand on them physiologically. So all this information is very, very insightful and is very important for me to take into account. Once I've then, of course, established how much of each ingredient they want to consume or need to consume based on their meal preferences, based on their caloric and macronutrient needs, what I then prioritize, of course, is ensuring that their dietary fiber is appropriate. Most clients I work with haven't consumed much fiber at all in their diet. For example, one client I've just onboarded recently had been consuming a keto/carnivore approach to his diet for the past 5 years or so, and was then asking me why he has such significant digestive health issues. It's because he hadn't consumed any fiber at all in his diet for the last quite literally 5 years, which subsequently, of course, wreaked havoc on his digestive health and well-being, which really, really isn't positive. So that's the next variable of priority for myself with the clients I work with. What we then do as a byproduct of having this all in place is we either determine if the client is going to be preparing their own meals and cooking them at home, if their wife or girlfriend may be doing the same thing for them, or for example, if we want to outsource their meal preparation to a personalised chef or a meal prep provider. Most clients I work with being 6 to 9 figure business owners, we work with a personal chef, and there's a few companies I work with to facilitate this, via which the chef drops off their meals 2 to 3 times per week so that they're fresh, they're kept in the fridge, reheated, and ready to go for the client. We can then ask them to manipulate the amount of each ingredient or interchange different food sources based on the client's preference and requests, and also based on what's needed for them to achieve their fitness, health, and body composition goals as well, which is really helpful. So in summary, that's my approach to establishing a meal plan for one of my one-to-one clients, again, who are 6 to 9 figure entrepreneurs, for whom I charge £15,000 for my first 12 weeks of service. That's the approach that I initially take, and I'd encourage you guys as aspiring fitness and health coaches or existing fitness and health coaches to take a very similar approach. And what I'll do as well is in the edits, I'll upload screenshots of existing meal plans of clients of mine so you can see and have some context for what that may look like as well, which may add some value to you. Until then guys, I shall see you in the next one. I'm going to enjoy the rest of the day on the beach in the south of France.